The room was too quiet. My father, Beco, slid a stack of papers across the table, his lips tight, his eyes full of cold judgment. "Sign this," he said firmly. My hands trembled as I reached for the folder I had hidden under my arm. He thought he had already won. He thought I would surrender everything. But the moment I opened my folder, the silence in the room shifted, and for the first time, my father's face turned pale. The family gathered around the long wooden table, and the air felt heavy. Beco sat at the head, his face serious, his hand resting on a stack of papers. He slowly pushed them across the table toward his daughter, Lami. His voice was firm as he told her to sign them. He said it was for the good of the family, but his eyes carried no warmth. He reminded her of how much he had done to raise her, saying she owed him and the family. Lami sat quietly, her hands in her lap, while everyone around the table watched. Her uncles and aunts nodded in agreement with Beco's words. Some even muttered that she should be grateful and do what her father asked. It seemed as if no one was on her side. The papers sat between them like a wall, demanding her future. Lami felt her chest tighten, but she did not reach out. She looked at the stack and then at her father, who leaned back in his chair with pride, as though he had already won. The room grew more tense with every passing second. Relatives whispered to one another, their voices carrying judgment. They said things about duty, about sacrifice, and about how a daughter must obey her father. Some even said it was shameful for her to hesitate. Beco lifted his chin, watching her with eyes that dared her to refuse. He wanted her to bend, to sign away what was rightfully hers, and to walk out of that room powerless. Lami's heart raced, but she stayed calm. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares pressing down on her. The table was no longer just a place for family, it had turned into a battlefield. On one side was her father, backed by a chorus of relatives. On the other side sat Lami, quiet, alone, but not as weak as they thought. She knew what those papers meant. They were not just words. They were her voice, her future, her mother's legacy, all at risk of being erased with a single signature. Still, she did not move her hand. She let the silence stretch, longer and longer, until even the relatives began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Her father's lips curved into a small, confident smile, certain she would give in. But Lami's eyes told a different story, one that no one was ready to hear. For years, Lami had been known as the quiet one. She rarely raised her voice, never argued with her father, and always obeyed without question. Everyone in the family had grown used to seeing her that way, soft, silent, and easy to control. That is why when Beco pushed the papers toward her, the entire room expected her to pick up the pen and sign without hesitation. But this time Lami's fingers didn't move. Instead, she sat straight, her calm eyes fixed on her father. The relatives leaned forward, waiting for her to obey, but Lami slowly shook her head. She did not touch the papers. Her refusal was not loud, not dramatic, but it was strong enough to freeze the room. The whispers began, questions flowing through the air. Was she refusing her father? Had she suddenly grown bold? Beco frowned, his pride stung, and his voice sharpened as he reminded her that she owed him everything. Yet Lami remained still, her breathing steady, her face unreadable. Then, without raising her tone, she reached into the bag resting by her chair. The family watched as she pulled out a folder of her own, its edges neat, its cover firm. She placed it on the table gently, pushing it forward until it sat beside the papers her father had demanded she sign. The action was simple, but the message was powerful. She was not empty-handed. She had come prepared. "I have something to share too," she said, her words soft but clear. For the first time, her voice carried weight in that room. The relatives who had been muttering earlier fell silent, their eyes darting between her father's documents and the folder she had placed on the table. Nobody had expected her to speak up, let alone bring her own evidence. Beco tried to laugh, brushing it off as a joke. To him, Lami had always been a child in his eyes, too meek to stand on her own. But there was no laughter in her face, only a calm determination that unsettled him. He reached out as though to pull the folder toward himself, but Lami placed her hand firmly on it, showing that she was in control of it. The tension in the room shifted. The daughter they had underestimated was no longer the silent shadow they remembered. In that moment, Lami showed them that she was not afraid, and her folder was more than just papers. It was the beginning of a truth none of them were ready to hear. Beco's eyes narrowed as he looked at the folder in front of him. His lips curled into a mocking smile, the kind that made the relatives shift uncomfortably in their seats. He leaned forward, his voice sharp and filled with pride, and told Lami that nothing she held in her hands could ever stand against him. To him, she was still just a daughter, a child who should bow her head when her father spoke. He laughed bitterly and said her papers were meaningless, just ink and signatures, while his authority was built on years of sacrifice. He turned to the family, his tone rising, as if he were giving a speech. He reminded everyone of the years he had worked day and night to feed them, how he had carried the weight of the family when times were hard, and how none of them would be sitting there if it weren't for him. His words painted himself as a hero, a man who had given everything. He made it sound as though Lami had no right to question him, no right to place her folder on the table. Relatives nodded in agreement, some even murmuring praise, saying Beco was right. They had always respected his loud voice, his strong presence, and the way he demanded control. But behind their nods was also curiosity. They wanted to know what Lami had in her folder. Still, Beco would not allow her to gain even a moment of strength. He turned back to her and belittled her openly. He called her ungrateful, saying she had eaten from his sweat and still dared to challenge him. He mocked her silence, claiming she had achieved nothing without him, and that her place was to obey, not to speak. His words cut deep, but Lami did not lower her eyes. She sat calmly, letting him throw his pride into the air. Every boast he made was meant to shrink her, to remind her of the power he thought he still held. He wanted the family to believe that no matter what proof she carried, it could never outweigh his years of sacrifice. Beco slammed his hand lightly on the table, declaring that fathers did not need to explain themselves to their daughters. Authority, he said, was his birthright, and no paper could challenge blood. The room grew tense again, the relatives watching closely to see if Lami would finally give in under the weight of his words. But Lami's quiet strength was still there, steady and unshaken, waiting for the right moment to speak. Lami took a deep breath, her hand resting on the folder she had placed on the table. For a moment, she stayed silent, letting her father's mocking words hang in the air. Everyone in the room thought she would finally lower her eyes and surrender, but instead, she opened the folder slowly. The relatives leaned forward as papers slid out, neat and carefully arranged. Her calmness was different this time. It carried strength, the kind that could no longer be ignored. She lifted the first set of documents and placed them where everyone could see. They were bank records, filled with balances that made some relatives gasp quietly. The figures were not small. They showed savings built carefully over years. Lami's voice, steady and clear, explained that her late mother had secretly saved money in her name. While her father had claimed control over everything in the household, her mother had quietly kept something aside, ensuring that her daughter would never be left empty. Next, Lami revealed investment records, shares in companies, small but steady, and proof of properties bought in her own name. The relatives blinked in disbelief. Nobody had known about this. They had always seen her as the weak daughter who depended on her father for everything. Yet here she was, proving she had built something lasting. Beco's face tightened, his confident smile fading for the first time. Lami explained further. After her mother's passing, she did not waste the savings left for her. She worked hard, studied, and grew it carefully. While the family thought she was simply quiet and passive, she had been planning her future, step by step, away from their eyes. Every extra coin she earned, she saved. Every chance to invest, she took it. And now, the folder in front of them was proof that she was no longer dependent on anyone, not even her father. The relatives whispered in shock. Some could not believe the numbers written in black and white. Others exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that Lami was stronger and smarter than they had imagined. For years they had underestimated her, thinking her silence was weakness. But silence had been her shield, and preparation had been her weapon. Beco tried to speak, but his words faltered. The room had shifted. The daughter he thought he controlled was showing the family that she was free. Lami looked directly at him, her hands steady on the table. The truth was now clear. His papers demanded her obedience, but her folder carried independence. What her father thought he could take away, she had already secured for herself. The room grew restless as Lami laid the last of her papers on the table. Every relative leaned forward, their eyes wide as They scanned the documents. The numbers, the property deeds, the ownership records, all of it was real, stamped and signed. Murmurs filled the air. Some shook their heads in disbelief, whispering to each other that it could not be possible. Others simply stared at Lami as though seeing her for the first time. For so long, she had been the quiet one in the corner, the one who never spoke against her father. Now she was standing taller than him without even raising her voice. Among the whispers, one voice rose clearly. It was Chuma, her cousin, a young man who had always been curious but never brave enough to challenge Beco. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on Lami, and asked the question that everyone else was too stunned to say. How had she managed to do all this? How had she saved, invested, and built wealth without anyone in the family noticing? His words carried both shock and admiration. For the first time, someone in the family spoke to her not as a child, but as a woman who had achieved something on her own. The room fell silent again, waiting for her answer. Lami did not rush. She explained simply, saying her mother had taught her to value silence and patience. While others shouted, she listened. While others spent, she saved. She said it was not magic but discipline, not luck but effort. Every coin her mother left, she guarded carefully. Every opportunity, she used wisely. Her voice was calm, but the weight of her truth was heavy, and the relatives felt it. Beco, however, could not accept it. His face turned hard as he leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. He called it lies, saying no daughter could achieve this without her father's guidance. He tried to laugh, but his voice was uneven. He told the family that Lami was tricking them, that the papers were probably fake, but the relatives did not move. Their eyes stayed on the documents, the stamps, the dates, the signatures that proved everything was genuine. Some of them began to murmur again, this time not against Lami but against Beco. Doubt crept into their voices. For years they had trusted his word, but now his denial looked weak beside the evidence. The balance in the room shifted quietly. Beco's power had always been his voice, but now his daughter's truth was stronger. His attempts to brush it off only deepened the silence around him, a silence filled with the weight of undeniable proof. The silence in the room grew heavy as the relatives studied the papers Lami had revealed. Their whispers filled the air, but beneath their surprise, another question began to rise. Why had Beco been so desperate for her to sign his own documents in the first place? Lami kept her eyes on her father, her calm gaze steady, while Beco shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time that evening, the strength in his voice seemed weaker. It was Chuma again who spoke first. He asked why Beco was forcing Lami to give up her rights if she clearly had her own means. What was hidden behind the papers he had pushed across the table? His question hung in the air like a sharp blade. Other relatives turned to look at Beco, their eyes narrowing, waiting for an answer. The confidence he had carried earlier began to slip, replaced by irritation. At first, Beco tried to repeat his old words. He said it was about unity, about protecting the family name, about keeping property safe under one hand. But this time his speech sounded empty. Lami sat still, not interrupting him, and simply pulled one more sheet from her folder. She placed it on the table, and the relatives leaned forward to see. It was proof, documents showing that Beco had large debts, loans he had been hiding and promises he had failed to keep. Gasps filled the air. The truth was clear now. The papers he had tried to make Lami sign were not about family unity at all. They were his attempt to take her share of the inheritance and use it to cover his own losses. He had planned to sacrifice his daughter's future to save himself. The relatives began to murmur louder, some shaking their heads in disappointment, others glaring at Beco with anger. They realized he had not been protecting the family, but protecting his own pride and his own mistakes. Lami's voice broke through the noise. She explained that she had discovered his debts months ago, but had chosen to stay quiet until the right moment. Tonight, when he thought he could pressure her into signing away her rights, she had decided it was time to reveal the truth. Her words were calm, but each one struck hard. The relatives stared at Beco, waiting for him to deny it, but he had no defense left. His shoulders sank, his face pale, and for the first time he could not meet anyone's eyes. The proud father who had stood so tall only minutes ago now looked smaller than ever. The truth had spilled into the open, and there was no hiding it anymore. The papers he had pushed forward were no longer weapons against his daughter. They were proof of his desperation. And in that moment, the family understood that Beco's authority had been built on fear, not on honesty. All eyes were on Lami, but this time, the weight of their stares no longer made her shrink. She sat tall, her hands resting on the table, her folder open before her like a shield. Her father had been exposed, his lies scattered across the table for everyone to see. The relatives still murmured, trying to process the truth, but Lami's voice cut through their whispers with calm strength. She did not shout, yet every word carried power. She said that respect could never be taken with threats or forced through papers. Respect, she explained, must be earned through actions, through honesty, and through fairness. Her eyes moved around the table, meeting the gazes of her uncles, aunts, and cousins. She told them that for years she had stayed silent, not because she was weak, but because she was watching and learning. And now she understood that silence had only fed her father's pride, giving him room to think he could control everything. The relatives shifted in their seats. For the first time, they were hearing her not as a quiet girl, but as a woman with strength. Chuma nodded slightly, agreeing with her words, and others began to look at her with respect rather than pity. The room that had once leaned heavily toward her father now seemed to tilt in her favor. The balance of power was changing, and everyone could feel it. Beco tried to interrupt, his voice rising, but Lami did not stop speaking. She told him directly that authority was not his birthright. A true leader does not take by force, he protects and guides. She reminded him that her mother had shown her the real meaning of strength, quiet sacrifice, discipline, and love. That was why her mother's savings had survived, and why Lami had grown independent while everyone thought she was powerless. Her words left the relatives thoughtful. Some exchanged glances, realizing that everything she said was true. For years, they had feared Beco's loud voice, but his actions had now been uncovered as selfish. Lami's calm voice, on the other hand, carried truth. Slowly, their loyalty began to shift. They were no longer nodding at Beco's speeches, they were listening to her. Lami ended her words by saying she would not sign away her future, and no paper could erase her worth. She had built herself quietly, and now she was standing firmly on her own ground. The relatives sat in silence, but the silence was no longer against her. It was filled with respect. For the first time, Lami was no longer seen as the weak daughter. She was the one holding the strength, and the family could not deny it. Beco's face darkened as the weight of the room began to slip from his hands. He clenched his fists on the table, his voice rising with anger. He called Lami stubborn, ungrateful, and disrespectful. He tried to remind everyone that he was still the head of the family, the one who had carried their burdens. For years, his tone was sharp, but beneath it was a crack that none could miss. The authority that once made the room fall silent now sounded shaky, as if his power was slipping away with every word. He stood from his chair, his presence looming over the table, but it did not have the same effect as before. The relatives no longer looked at him with fear. Instead, they glanced at Lami, waiting for her response. His anger, once a weapon, had turned into a sign of weakness. The more he shouted, the more it was clear that his control was broken. His voice cracked again, and for the first time, his words fell flat in the very room he used to command. Lami did not flinch. She remained seated, calm and steady, her folder still open before her. When the noise of his shouting finally faded, her voice entered the silence, soft, clear, and strong. She said the time for fear had ended. The family deserved fairness, not control. She announced that the land her father wanted to claim would not be taken by one hand alone. It would be managed in a way that protected everyone, so that every child in every branch of the family could benefit, not just him. Her words sent a ripple through the room. The relatives who had stayed quiet all evening began nodding in agreement. Some even sighed in relief, as if her plans carried hope they had not heard before. She explained that her investments in independence were not just for herself, but proof that the family could thrive if guided by fairness and wisdom. She promised to create opportunities for each member, to make sure no one was left behind. Beco's lips tightened as he tried to speak again, but his voice no longer held the room. Every pair of eyes turned toward Lami. She was the one being listened to now, her calm voice carrying more weight than his shouting ever had. The shift was undeniable. The authority had passed from father to daughter. As she finished, the relatives leaned closer, their respect for her clear. In that moment, It was no longer Beco who defined the family's future. It was Lami, the daughter they had once overlooked, who now held the power to guide them all. The room settled into a stillness after Lami's last words. Everyone's eyes moved from her calm face to Beco, waiting to see how he would answer. For years, he had been the loudest voice in the family, the one who always had something to say, always certain of his authority. But now he sat frozen in his chair, his lips pressed tightly together. His anger had drained, leaving behind a heavy silence that filled every corner of the room. The same man who had shouted only minutes earlier could not form a single word. His chest rose and fell quickly, but no sound came out. The relatives watched closely, stunned by the sight. Beco, the father who had built his power on control, could not fight against the truth laid in front of him. The folder on the table, the one his daughter had carried so quietly, was the weapon that had cut through all his pride. He lowered his gaze to it, staring at the documents spread neatly across the table. Each page told him the same story. His control was gone. The debts he had hidden were exposed, his attempt to take her rights had failed, and his daughter had proven herself stronger than anyone imagined. He lifted his hand as if to reach for the papers, but he stopped halfway, his fingers trembling before pulling back. He could not touch them, not when they had stripped him of everything he thought he held. The relatives shifted in their seats, their whispers soft but full of meaning. They were no longer questioning Lami, they were questioning him. The silence he held was louder than all his shouting. It told the family more than his speeches ever had. It told them that he had been defeated, not by force but by truth. Chuma's eyes moved from Beco to Lami, and even he could not hide his respect for her anymore. One by one, the family members' attention left Beco and rested fully on his daughter. His silence had made it clear. He had nothing left to stand on. The respect he had demanded for years had slipped away in a single evening, and it was not coming back. Beco's shoulders sank lower as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He looked at his daughter, but she did not shrink from his stare. Instead, she sat steady, her hands folded calmly, her folder still in front of her like a crown she had earned. The father who once commanded the family with his voice was now quiet, and his silence was the final sign that the power had left him forever. Lami rose slowly, her chair scraping back as every eye in the room followed her. She no longer looked like the quiet daughter who once stayed in the corners while decisions were made. She stood tall, her shoulders straight, her face calm but firm. Her voice carried clearly as she spoke, steady and sharp like a blade cutting through the thick silence. "You pushed papers to take away my future," she said. Her gaze locked on her father. "I pushed mine to protect it. From today, you cannot silence me again." Her words echoed, and for the first time, no one dared to interrupt. The family that had always looked to Beco for direction now turned fully toward her. Even the elders, who had once dismissed her voice, leaned forward with respect shining in their eyes. In that moment, she was not just speaking for herself but for every time she had been ignored, overlooked, or pushed aside. Beco's face hardened, but he still said nothing. His silence only gave more power to her voice. The relatives shifted, realizing the weight of what had just happened. They no longer saw her as the obedient daughter to be ordered around. They saw her as a leader, someone who had stood up, fought with truth, and claimed her rightful place. The air in the room had changed completely. Where once Beco's presence filled it with fear, now Lami's strength filled it with certainty. She gathered her folder and pressed it to her chest. Not as a shield, but as a sign of victory. Her words had built a wall no one could tear down. The family sat stunned, their silence a mixture of shock and respect. Some nodded quietly, others looked at her with admiration. And even those who had doubted her now understood. They had witnessed a turning point. Lami had not only defended her future, she had rewritten the way her family would see her forever. As she stood in the center of the room, her final words lingered in the air like a promise. She was no longer the daughter who waited for permission to speak. She was the woman who had claimed her voice, and with it her power. The family knew in their hearts that nothing would ever be the same again.